Hello and welcome to another episode of the Minor Compositions podcast. Today, we're joined by Przemysław Strożek, whose name I probably just butchered very badly, but I'm sorry for that up to begin with, who is working at the Institute of Art, Polish Academy of Sciences, and the Archive of the Avant-Garde in Dresden. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, hello. Thank you for inviting me. I'm happy to.
So I wanted to invite you to come along to talk about not one but two of your books, which I thought would be very interesting to discuss right now at this particular time. And that's a book you edited 2 years ago with Andreas Kramer called Sport in the European Avant-Garde, 1900 to 1945, and your monograph from a year ago, picturing the Workers' Olympiad and the Spartakiads, Modernist and the Avant-Garde's engagement with sport in Central Europe and the USSR from 1920 to 1932. And the reason I thought this would be super interesting for this particular period of time is we're getting towards the end of the Euros and we're right before the Olympics. So we're in a sort of, Bermuda Triangle perfect scenario of sporting ecosystems. And I thought, oh, well, here would be a good moment to sort of, have a nice conversation about these sort of histories, which are, I'm going to say, at least partially forgotten by lots of people, and sort of unpack some of those. So I think it'd be an interesting conversation. So maybe as a point to start off, so a lot of your work seems to be on this overlap of let's say sports history and the arts, the avant-garde, correct?
Right. Yes.
This is a very basic question. Like, that's a quite interesting topic, but kind of niche. How did you get there? Like, what brought you to that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I feel, and I think it's a very good reference to the Euros because I remember I started to work on the sport and avant-gardes, or like generally about sport and visual arts, just before the Euro 2012, which was held in Poland and Ukraine. I mean, you cannot imagine that, for example, there were still stadiums, in Donbass, in Donetsk, right? Right now, there is a war, nothing is there. But I think final or half final was in Donetsk. So it's unbelievable, right? Like the history, how this region is right now destroyed, and only the memories of the Euros are coming alive. And yes, I remember 2012, I started to work on that subject because I come from art history, and like I'm a scholar who deals with avant-garde history, but I'm also a huge sports fan, and huge fan of sport history. So I decided that 2012, by the time, it's a great opportunity to bring all my kind of fascinations together, like avant-garde history and sport history. And I started to publish a lot of articles in 2012, which connected the sport and art with Euros 2012. And I think this was the beginning. And then I remember 2013, there was a conference at the National Museum of Football in Manchester. It was 150 years of FA, of founding the FA, and I also presented there talk on Polish contemporary art and football, how those issues come together. And these were the starting points, and then I decided to develop my research into beyond football, because at the beginning I was only focusing on football and avant-garde. And I started to discover many new things which I didn't know about, and especially worker sport. And I remember I read the book edited by James Riordan and Ante Krüger, as I remember well. It's a book from 1996 about the international history of the worker sport. I think it was 2016. And I came across it studying the constructivism, because artists connected to constructivism, like Elisitsky, were involved in projects of the worker sport. So actually, the relationships between worker sports and avant-garde started 4 years after I started the research on sport and avant-garde. So around 2016, and then I decided I will publish a book, and I received also a grant from funding from the National Science of Center in Poland on studying sport and visual arts in the interwar years.
I quite like the way you describe it, because I think for me it's been quite similar in terms of you're interested in one thing or two things or three things, and then discover that they connect in ways you hadn't thought they would or anticipated, and then actually finding that connection to be super interesting in itself. I mean, to give you just a bit of background, Minor Compositions as a book series originally started out of a particular interest in the overlap of the avant-garde aesthetics and autonomous Marxism, right? So people like Franco Berardi, Negri, Silvio Federici, and then I also just discover that these folks are also super interested in sports. So, for instance, like Antonio Negri is also what allegedly was one of the founders of the Red and Black Brigades, the AC Milan Ultras. So you have these sort of like these submerged connections that you sort of wouldn't have been the main thing you would think of, but they're there.
Yeah, I mean, I went to the worker sports through the avant-gardes, and when I started like to deep much more into that subject, like I saw that like there is something there. Like, I mean, especially when I started to look upon the avant-garde journals, then I saw the avant-garde journal by Czechoslovakian artists called Red. I mean, the color red, and it was abbreviation of Review Devět because of the group Devět, which was a engaged leftist group in Czechoslovakia. And I saw that like on one of the covers, there is a project of the stadium for the second Spartakiad in Prague. So I saw then, there is a connection between the Czechoslovakian Spartakiad and the Russian Spartakiad, and I started to dig more into it, and I found more materials than around the second Spartakiad, which failed in Berlin, so then I decided it would be great to publish a book on that subject. I remember 2018, I also wrote a text on football in Italian futurism and fascism, which is another angle, but always kind of, I saw how much avant-gardes were connected to sports and politics. Like for example, the Italian futurists, they were really much involved in the 1934 World Cup in Italy, which was won by the fascist country at the time. So I found it also interesting, those political kind of approaches to sport and avant-garde.
Didn't Marinetti design a poster for that World Cup? Or
I mean, this is a very good question. I think, and in a lot of publications, there is this information that Marinetti designed it, but I found one book in Italy, and it was, I think, Marinelli. So there is most probably an error in that, that it wasn't Marinetti, because I think he couldn't done it. I mean, he definitely was a person who loved sports, but I don't think he could have designed a poster, because he was not a visual artist. He was a poet, and most probably it was this Marinelli. I mean, I found a lot of publications when the Marinetti is kind of regarded as an artist who did this posters, but I think this was this Marinelli, another guy, but very, very similar names.
Well, that actually makes more sense. I always kind of wondered why he all of a sudden designed a poster out of nowhere, but
yeah.
One of the things I wanted to ask you about, and so this something comes up a few times in both books, is at a certain point you say something like, when we're looking at these histories, in terms of current academic literature, a lot of times this is being looked at more from a sports history viewpoint, and less from an art historical or visual culture angle, which I find interesting. I'm kind of curious about how or why that happens, because I can see why it would be of interest to sports historians, but it seems kind of a curious absence if there's not sort of that interest coming from the other direction, if you know what I mean.
Yes, yeah. I actually tomorrow I have a talk here in Dresden about football and avant-garde, which is kind of in connection with the Euros. And like people are asking me like, why you are dealing with sport? Like, why sport is so interesting? I mean, like the people from the art world, or like the curators, or the people with whom I worked, and I feel that like from the side of art history, there is a sort of lack of understanding the importance of sport. I think like there are really few art historians who are dealing with sport topics. Like for example, Daniel Haxel is a great scholar, or Michael Mahoney, or Andreas Kramer. They are really great scholars who deal with that subject, but you cannot find, I think, more than 20 people uh, who kind of deal with that subject from the side of art history.
But I guess the reason why I find it strange is because maybe even almost if you could just drop the word sport itself and say, hey, are you interested in the connection of the arts and this thing which connects to the rise of modernization, industrialization, mass publics, media effects, cultural soft power being exercised, you know?
But then still, you need to know the sport history, and you need to kind of look upon the sport history. And I think this is not an interesting subject for art historians, I believe. Because when I was researching the topic on avant-gardes and sport in the 1920s, I found like that sport history is so interesting. I mean, there are so many unbelievable histories surrounding the sports. Like I think Czechoslovakia, it's amazing place, for example, where all the political kind of fractions of sport and art kind of mingled together, right? Because you had a socialist sport there, you had a communist sport there, you had a Sokol, which was kind of a pan-Slavic kind of paramilitary movement. You had the Orzeł, which was a Christian sport. You had the Olympic movement, and all those like five kind of social, very important phenomena come together within sport and arts in such a small country. And I think you cannot understand the relationships between sport and art without this historical background of sport history. And I feel that like art historians do not have much understanding for sport history. They don't find it important, I believe. Like I wouldn't say everyone, but like many of them.
Do you think any of those interesting subtle political differences you were describing a bit there had any effect on ways people actually approached particular sports themselves? I'll give you an example here. I remember reading this interview with Tony Negri where he says that he argues that Catenaccio, this sort of defensive Italian football, is a byproduct of conditions of class struggle in Italy,
Oh, okay.
which I think is very clever, but I don't know whether I buy it. So was there like, oh, well, you see, actually, the Communist Party was playing a more positional system. However, while the anarchists were, was there any sort of like difference actually tactically, or was it just more of like let's say the sociological, the social relations of those politics just happened to play out through sports?
Yeah, it's very. I didn't know about it. I think it's very interesting issue. I remember when I was reading a book by Michael Mahoney about sport in the USSR, which is an amazing book, and he also had like an idea that the goalkeeper, the image of goalkeeper, he was the last man who defends the nation, right? Like on the front line. So actually, this explains also a lot of depictions of goalkeeper, and goalkeepers in films in Soviet Union, and also Lev Yashin, who in the 1960s was the best goalkeeper in the world. So actually, this also explains somehow like the relationships between sport and
But it also helps explain existentialism, because who was a goalkeeper? Camus.
Yeah.
And he literally claims his sense of ethics was informed by being a goalkeeper, which I find quite interesting.
Yeah, definitely.
Or maybe his sense of absurdity, where no matter what he does, if he makes a mistake, everyone blames it. Oh, it's your fault, Albert.
Yeah.
That's super interesting. So you have this sort of like this. I guess the way I would see after reading both books is sports. Sorry, the avant-garde and sports are connected here as this part of this broader process of developing a workers' culture, right?
Yes. Also, and maybe also like coming back, because we talked about like the perspective from the art history, but I think like the sport historians are much more interested in art history than art historians in sport history, right? So here I think it's also like this kind of like the sport historians would love to know more about the visual studies and about art history than art historians about sport history. So just like as a addition to
part of the reason that I'm gonna forget the name of the guy who wrote the chapter. There's a chapter on vorticism.
Yes, yeah.
And there's a bit there where the author says something like, part of the difficulty that folks in England had relating to sports at that time was because sports were very much part of an imperial soft power project, and that embedding of sports in that sort of form of imperial soft power meant that if you were, let's say, skeptical about imperial soft power, you then also became skeptical about sports as well.
Yeah, it's interesting thesis. I mean, like it was written by John Huxon, who is a sport historian, right? So we also like to that book we invited also some sport historians like John Huxon. Yeah.
Cool. Where we
we were talking about the workers' movement.
Yes.
Sport was like a kind of intrinsic element of the workers' movement, and yes, indeed, because when we think about two huge organizations, the Lucerne Sport International, which in the 1928 became Socialist International Sporting International, and the Red Sport International, they were the biggest mass movements, I think, in the world at that time. I mean, like only the Red Sport International had like around 4 million members. So when you think about how huge organization was that, of course, like the most of them were from Soviet Union, but there were also some parts in other countries like Czechoslovakia. But they were huge mass movements because sport attracts masses. Like no museum or no art gallery will attract so much attention as sport events, right? Sport events at the stadiums, but also the sport demonstrations on the streets. I think it was very interesting that in 1934, one of the major worker sport events was the anti-fascist rally in Paris, which was regarded, a demonstration was regarded as a sport event. And I found it also kind of interesting. But it goes a little bit beyond the topic of my book, because I focus on the 1920, 1932, and especially on Central and Eastern Europe, because I think when we think also about the kind of tensions between centers and peripheries, right? Especially in art history, it's very much visible that, Paris, London, New York are the centers of art world, right? When we think about worker sport movements, the centers are Prague, Moscow, and Berlin, right? So here is the center, and west is peripheries, sort of.
And Vienna?
Vienna as well, yeah. Vienna more the socialist, so more moderate sport movement, while the others were more radical. I mean, the Vienna held this 1931 Workers' Olympics, which was a moderate socialist event, while Spartakiads, which were more radical, organized by communists, were organized in Moscow and were meant to be staged in Prague and in Berlin.
I suppose that's asked about Vienna for two reasons. One is one book I read was starting to read about sports and politics. I've read a bunch of books by Gabriel Kuhn, and he edited a nice collection by, blanking on his name, Austro-Marxist Julius Deutsch.
Yes, yeah, he was the president of the Socialist International in Austria. Yeah, and I think Gerhard Kuhn, right? He's the author of that books on Deutsch. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's interesting because I think his particular book there is more focused on, let's say, the role of sports in building working class culture in the 1920s. And I don't think actually goes very much into the visual aspects of it that I remember. I mean, it's a good book, you know.
Yeah. I also read it, but it's more on him as a personality, as I remember. I read it like a couple of years ago, so I don't remember right now exactly. But when I was doing the Austrian chapter of my book, which is centered around the 1931 Olympics in Vienna, I was interested in the sculptures produced around that time, because Vienna was called the Red City, right? The Red Vienna, because it was managed by socialists at that time, and sport was a major magnet for them and propaganda tool. Because also the first big stadium was built for that occasion. The stadium, which is now the national stadium in Austria, in Vienna, it was built for the purpose at the beginning for the Workers' Olympics in 1931. So it's also interesting that like such a huge project, which was designed by Otto Schweitzer, a very important modernist architect, who later on, who before designed the Nuremberg Stadium, the stadium which is known for Hitler's speeches, right, in the 1930s. But it was designed for the Workers' Olympics in Nuremberg. It's also kind of interesting connections, I think. So when we think about the Vienna and art around Vienna, it was not avant-garde so much. It was like kind of socialist propaganda in a way, where sport and football played a very important role for the construction of the new man of socialism. So also that's why the title of my book is Modernist and Avant-Garde Engagement, because I also look upon the more kind of moderate references to worker sport, and this is in Vienna. It's not avant-garde at all, or like the Workers' Olympics in Frankfurt. It's not. It's also very much modest. While the propaganda for the Spartakiads in Prague and in Moscow was done by avant-garde artists.
It's interesting because if you read books by do you know Jonathan Wilson?
Yes, I know I know the name.
I'm thinking of the books like Inverting the Pyramid, about the history of football tactics, or then he did a book called Voices Long Ago. And a lot of what he writes about there ends up being like how the history of football tactics over the 100 years, a lot of it starts in, I guess you'd say, Eastern European Jews, particularly in Hungary and Vienna, having to flee fascism. So there you have almost like tactical differences end up being traced back to their, maybe more so than aesthetic visual differences.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I didn't know that research before. But what I found interesting by this by this Workers' Olympics in Vienna is that like, and Julius Deutsch, he was the organizer of that. He said that like the Workers' Olympics is mainly focused on the defense, like that we need to defend our workers' rights and not be aggressive toward the working class struggle. I mean, so it was a little bit different than the Spartakiad in Moscow. So it was like kind of moderate way of thinking about the working class struggle in a defensive way. And there were also a lot of like when you think about the sporting disciplines, there were also like defense troops, military troops also making some exercises in that. Because sport also comes from military training, right? Like a lot of sport events are very close connected to military. When you think about, I don't know, like of course, running or biathlon is the best example. when you are skiing and shooting, it's like training. It's a typical military training which was done before in Finland or in Soviet Union as well.
Would it be fair to say that the rise of worker sports in the 1920s is at least in partial response to the Olympics itself?
Yes, I think so. I think so because actually this is a very important issue because Olympics were regarded by the founders of the worker sport movements as a fascist events and as a nationalist events. And also the first Workers' Olympics in Frankfurt in 1925, the idea was not to show the flags of nation flags. I mean, everyone was under the red flag. So red flag kind of united all the nations at this event. And it was a kind of counter Olympics to the Olympics in Paris in 1924, which was regarded as a kind of a nationalistic event. Described, for example, by Lajos Kaszak, in what I'm quoting in my book. And when you also think about the International Olympic Committee and which kind of states were chosen to host Olympics, you see that 1936 you have Berlin, right? The Nazi country that time. 1940 it was supposed to be Tokyo, and so another fascist country. And 1944 the Winter Olympics was supposed to be held in Cortina d'Ampezzo, so in fascist Italy. So actually within the span of 8 years you have the axis Berlin, Tokyo, Rome, right? So like this kind of a fascist axis. So actually the workers' sport movement was also reacting very much against the Olympic Games, which was viewed as a sort of a nationalistic event.
So, how do I put this? How would people competing in, for instance, the Workers' Olympics judge or think about success or achievement? Like in the sense that if it's not about like personal glory, national glory, because that's being rejected, then what is the criteria of we did it, comrades?
Yeah, I think this is one of the failure of the workers' sport movement, that like not many people understood the goals of that, like because you didn't like if you were competing, but when you were first, you received not a medal but a diploma, right? And like you were at the same level as other people. Like you didn't have this podium, right? Like everyone was standing at the same level, democratic level. So no one was kind of above other people. I mean, it was much more about kind of spending time together. Also about propaganda, transmitting propaganda through the sport events because they attracted masses. But these things about competition, it was competitive also, like because the people were I remember when I watched the movie on the documentary of the Frankfurt Olympics in 1925, like one of the captions read that like, oh, there's a sports record which has beaten the record from Olympics. So actually this things that like it was not competitive and not about records, it was not always true. And but this is why it also confused a little bit. It was also confusing for countries. And also I think it's important to remember that Soviet Union and Germany at the beginning were disqualified for the Olympic Games after the First World War. So actually they couldn't compete.
Okay.
And Spartakiads and also the first Workers' Olympic in Frankfurt was against the exclusion of Germans, because the German team couldn't compete in 1920 Olympics in Antwerp and 1924 in Paris because they lost the war. Then they began from 1928 being at the Olympics. But before that, they could only compete at the Workers' Olympics. So it was also a possibility for them to compete. And when it comes to the Soviet Union didn't participate in the Olympic Games until 1952. So actually, this was kind of counter Olympics for them.
If I can give you another example of that kind of similar dynamic about thinking about achievement, recently I was reading a book by, I'm gonna butcher his name, Carlos Vinas, about St. Pauli, the team from Hamburg, which everyone vaguely lefty or countercultural loves. And one of the things he says in the book several times is St. Pauli is, we don't care about winning; it's all about solidarity, community. And I like that idea because everyone likes community and solidarity and working class culture. But I'm 99% sure that if you go to a St. Pauli match, people there want to win and they will get angry and cheer and boo and yell about how the team is playing more so than like working class culture. Yay! I mean,
yeah, I remember there was a time where, because I was a huge St. Pauli fan couple of years ago, now maybe a little less. And I was also going, especially from Warsaw to Hamburg to see a game and coming back. So it was only actually about having party, right? Like we actually didn't care. I remember when I was there, I think we lost 2-0 and the second game it was 0-0. I think it was the third league, but back time it was 2008 or 2007 when I was there. And then I was 2016, the game with Union Berlin. And actually it was only about party, as I remember. I mean, it was less about like winning or losing. I think
maybe it's kind of like in this Euros, a bunch of my son's friends have all adopted Scotland. In particular, there's a song everyone's singing, "No Scotland, No Party," which has the line about like maybe this time we'll get out of the group stage.
Yeah.
And it just becomes about that rather than anything else.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, like, yeah, right now St. Pauli is coming to the Bundesliga, right? They got promotion this year. So I think they are coming good. And this what I stopped liking about St. Pauli is that it started to be a kind of advertised, I don't know, like kind of commercial place, you know, with all the schools and this kind of pirates symbols to sell. You have like shops everywhere in Hamburg to buy it. It's like kind of commercializing the football club, which has a very beautiful history of being the first anti-fascist club in Germany.
See, that's interesting because having read the St. Pauli book, I know that St. Pauli's anti-fascist history is basically really from the 1980s onward.
Yes.
And if you look at St. Pauli's behavior in the 1930s, they were actually, I'll say, how do I say this politely, a little bit opportunist.
Could be.
But I wouldn't blame them because when you're dealing with literal fascism, sometimes saving your own life is, yeah, I can understand that.
Yeah, I mean, like I end my book with a chapter on Berlin, and especially on the club called Fichte, which I find very, very interesting because a lot of members of the club were not only athletes but also actors in the workers' theater, and also they staged and they played. 4,000 members of this club played in the movie Kule Wampe, which was screenplayed by Bertolt Brecht. and directed by a Bulgarian communist, Zlatan Dudov, in 1931. And actually, it's very interesting how a sport club, because is portrayed by Brecht and Dudov, and the members of that club are playing in that movie, so they are becoming actors.
So do you think there's situations where we have a coach who's like, okay, lads, we're going to train today, but first we're going to do a bit on Meyerhold and biomechanics?
Yeah, I mean, like, I don't know if there are some biomechanics involved in that movie, but actually, I found it interesting, and it was the Kule Wampe. The movie was the last leftist movie in the Weimar Republic. I mean, it was the last premiere of this kind of movies. Then all others were banned. And actually, after 1932 and 1933, when Nazis came to power, the members of the workers' movement moved either to Prague or to Switzerland. And for example, the members of the workers' clubs in Berlin and in Germany, they moved to Prague because they would be killed by the Nazis after 1933.
One of the things I really love about reading your book, the monograph, was getting a sense of that workers' sports weren't existing in isolation, but were connected to Brecht, workers, the theater movement, worker photography. So we had this overlap of different kinds of cultural practices that were all part of developing the new man, or the new proletarian culture, or the what's the phrase that this is something else, but where Tanner Mays talks about sport as the advanced school of collective feeling, which becomes this way that all these things are overlapping and reinforcing each other and producing this sort of like other sense of, here's how we can make culture and life in a way that isn't based upon nationalism or worry about profitability.
Yeah, I think also I write a little bit about the workers' photography because there is an interesting intersection, and I feel that very interesting example is the Hungarian workers' club called MTE. Sorry, my Hungarian is so awful, I cannot pronounce the name, the full name of that club. But it was very much like a club with not only members who were staging theater performances, but also photographers, because workers' photography movement was very important, especially in the 1930s in Eastern Europe, especially in Czechoslovakia and Hungary, to the lesser extent in Poland. And there were very important photographers as members of this club. And doing photography was far much easier as a cultural entertainment than, for example, painting or sculpture, right? Like that's why the artistic medium for workers was much more photography than any other medium as painting or sculpture, which involves academic training. Well, photography, you don't kind of need that. I mean, nowadays you need, but it was a new medium and you could experiment it in many other ways.
Yeah, I remember reading about that was it 10 years ago that the Reina Sofia did that really lovely exhibition on the history of worker photography?
Yes, and it was a very great catalog. I mean, I haven't seen the exhibition, unfortunately, but I read, of course, the catalog, which shows like the workers' photography movement in Hungary, Slovakia, and Germany, Austria as well. But I was surprised that actually there was not so much about worker sport there, even if worker sport was so important for the workers' photographers. So actually, I believe that like my book is also kind of extension of the research on the workers' photography from Reina Sofia project. I hope it will be read like that.
Interesting you say that, because for a few years, I was working with the Reina Sofia, working on the research that went into an exhibition that was hosted there last year. And one of my first suggestions, because I was talking with the folks there about the work of the pocket movement, is how about the art museum plans an anti-fascist World Cup? And they were like, what? Why would we do that? Admittedly, it would be a bit strange for a large national museum to plan a football competition, but I think that actually would have been a logical continuity of things.
And especially in Spain, right? Because there was a planned Workers' Olympics in 1936, and for the July 1936, and actually it's supposed to be staged. The so-called Olimpiada Popular. It's supposed to be staged the day when the Spanish Civil War began. So actually, the athletes who arrived to Spain, to Barcelona, went to the barricades, and the event was cancelled. And the communists who arrived there, they fought against the fascists. They fought against the fascists in 1936 because they were there. There are very interesting photographs from the beginnings of the Spanish Civil War, where you see people on the barricades, and behind there are posters advertising the Workers' Olympics in Barcelona. So actually, the Spanish context is very interesting and important in the context of the anti-fascism and sport. And I think this kind of like World Cup could be a good idea.
There's this really lovely essay by Eric Cantona called "What Is Life," where he talks about his grandfather fleeing Barcelona to go to France, and him later finding pictures of his grandparents in Spain, right before fleeing fascism. And then he talks about his own relationship to movement and freedom, and sort of his relationship to football, informed by his parents' understanding of movement and fleeing fascism.
Yeah. I mean, this is a very, very interesting subject. I mean, as I said, like my book finished with the 1932 the year, and I would love to also explore the Workers' Olympics in Barcelona, 1936, which I didn't have time yet to do that. And I think it's a great subject to kind of explore further.
Another thing I quite like in your book, you talk about the Workers' Olympics, is the ways in which, and I guess this goes back to the ancient Greek Olympics, is that sport and culture, or sport and art, were not seen as separate, but as being co-equal, and you would actually be doing artistic events as part of the Olympics. And I quite like that idea in a way that I mean, what I would love to see is the Euros and with the sort of 100th anniversary of recreating Arseny Avmerov's Symphony of the Factory Sirens. That would be
that would be great. I mean, like also when you think about the Olympic Games, there were exhibitions and very important events called the Olympic art competitions. And actually, the artists, just like athletes, were awarded medals for the best paintings or best sculptures and so on. So, actually, sport and art was also very intrinsic regarding Olympics. I mean, this idea of the Olympic art competitions was abandoned after London, 1948. So now there is no Olympic competitions. But I remember when I was doing also research on the Olympics, the Polish artists received a bronze medal in graphic design and a golden medal in sculpture, and it was included in the medal table. So actually, it was kind of like, I mean, in the press in the 1928, when I was reading the press, it was, we received bronze. And I was checking, like, no, it was an artist. It wasn't like an athlete, and it was included in the medal table in Poland. So I found it interesting that sport and arts also, like in the Olympic idea, was supposed to be not separated, but like very much inclusive. Because when you think about the beginnings of the Olympic Games, it was all about art, also about the sculpture, about like the in ancient Greece, there was no kind of difference between sport and arts in the fifth century before Christ, right? The same was also, of course, for the Workers' Olympics, where the artists were engaged to create propaganda works, like, for example, Gustav Kluchis, who was commissioned by the Red Sport International to produce the postcards, right, for the Spartakiads. The famous one, which kind of like didn't satisfy the steering committee of the Spartakiads, but actually it's one of the major documents of how artists created propaganda works for the worker sport.
I suppose there you have the interesting thing we have an emergence of this kind of working class culture, but you also have sort of new forms of art production and media happening at the same time. So you have the rise of, or the popularization of the photo montage, using video and audio in different ways, not always the best ways. I'm thinking here of how someone like now we're further ahead of your book, but how someone like Lenny Riefenstahl is actually super influential in terms of actually how to shoot video and audio and combine imagery.
Yeah, and she was also involved in the production of the Workers' Olympics in Frankfurt when she was younger. Yeah, like so it's also interesting that she already was at the production of the 1925 Workers' Olympics. And yeah, I mean, what I found also interesting that like when you think about the Olympic Games and the Olympic art competitions, there were competitions around painting, sculpture, like graphic design, so like traditional visual media. While the Spartakiads were, as you said, like much more experimental forms as photomontage, for example, or workers' photography. This was like the kind of progressive way of visual propaganda of that events.
But it's interesting because I remember the first time I came across a quote from, I believe it was Shostakovich, who in the mid-20s describes football as the ballet of the masses. And the first time I saw that, I thought it was interesting because it was making this sport culture comparison in a way that today sounds a bit strange. But in a context where sport and art are co-equal, it's not a weird statement. It's actually just a very logical one.
Yeah, and I also remember like the producers of the Russian ballets in Paris, like the Serge Diaghilev, right, in the 1920s. They were staging the tennis, right, as a ballet. So already like sport was a kind of linked very much to the ballet enterprise. Not entertainment, sorry, ballet entertainment. So and also I remember when there was a artistic and cultural events around Paris, 1924. There was also an event called Ballet Olympique. So there were also kind of like athletic disciplines turned into ballet. Also, futurists, Italian futurists were staging the dance of tennis, the dance of football. What I also found interesting that, like, I remember I read something across that in Palermo, in Sicily, there was a project of a local football team, the Palermo was playing in pink. Nowadays, they were supposed to stage a theater play about their team in one of the Sicilian theaters. So I kind of found it also interesting how theater, performance, ballet is linked to the sports.
One play that's been staged in the UK recently, which plays with the overlap, is the play Dear England. And what that is about is almost like how the sense of national identity is being transformed and molded and changing, but how you can see this through how the national team is basically managed, right? where it becomes this sort of like proxy for the changing understanding of the nation yeah.
Yeah, I didn't came across it.
Oh, no, that's okay. It was probably one of those places that was big in England and nowhere else, which is understandable given the name. One thing I was really struck by, and I'm going to butcher the guy's name, Hungarian guy. You quote the article both in both books, Lajos Kasik.
Lajos Kasik.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I guess is he writing in the mid-20s? It's an article called "Sport and Mass Organization."
Yes.
And I think the quote here I really like, and I'm going to read it out. Sorry, but it's really good. Is we say something like, "If we were to ask what sports means today and how it affects individuals and large masses, then the answer would be simple. Today, sport is a manifestation of war, something that's special for the individual, and a dangerous drug for the masses." So I think that here you have basically what is I'll call like the current like lefty critique of why sports are crap, i.e., they're nationalist doublifying of everyone, right?
Yeah.
But then he goes, yeah, but if we ask what organizational benefits we could draw sorry, I missed the yeah. So, but if we ask what the organizational benefits we could draw from the conscious control sporting obsession, then we can answer this: that sport is a new social order that carries the basic principles of the collective human community, as it captivates both individuals and great masses. And I really love it because he's saying, yeah, the way people do sports today is kind of crappy and feeds into war and individualism and competition, all these bad things. But it could be something else. And therefore, maybe you should actually pay attention to it rather than just saying it's crappy and nationalist.
Yeah, I mean, like Lajos Kasik was also like responding to the Olympic Games in Paris, right? Because it was 1924. The article comes from the Hungarian magazine published in Vienna, like avant-garde magazine called Ma. And yeah, he was like criticizing Olympic Games in Paris. But on the other hand, he saw a very huge potential of sport as a kind of way of uniting people also through the socialist ideas, because he was a very engaged socialist at that time. When in the 1919 the Hungary was for half a year a communist country, he was one of the major figures who supposed to kind of be responsible for culture in Hungary. But then he needed to flee in 1920 after the communist Hungarian Republic of Councils failed. So he was writing from the perspective in Vienna, and in Vienna he also mingled with socialists who were there. And of course, he was also a major person for the Hungarian left when he came back to Hungary in 1926. He also connected with this MTE group, club, the socialist club in Hungary. And he was like very fascinated about this club, that this club has the potential of what he was saying in 1924 of this new social order.
What's interesting is that I once went to an anarchist info shop in Budapest, and I got this little photocopied zine about the history of Ma. And it was claiming that basically he invented the idea of art activism.
Yes. Yeah.
And so I was reading about him like 10 years ago, but in terms of activist art politics and the use of art for political means. But it's funny that there was no mention of his relationship to sport again.
Yeah, and because like at the beginning he was not much interested in sports. I mean, this is the only article I actually found in Ma from him. After he came back in 1926 to Budapest and Ma was no longer active as a group, then he founded a magazine called Munka. And this magazine is translation of the word work, the work. So he was very much connected to the workers' movement, and Munka was a kind of magazine related to more to the workers' movement, while Ma was still very much kind of avant-garde magazine to arts and visual arts, while Monka was much more socially engaged. I mean, you mentioned activism, and actually, yeah, like Kaszak was a founder of activist group. I mean, they called themselves activism in 1916, as I remember, during the First World War. But the word activism that time was different than the word activism now. So actually, it was more about action arts, like action, and less about like activism in a way we are understanding it now, I think.
Okay, makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, but of course the name was the same. They called themselves activists, and he was issuing a magazine called Atet, which was subtitled Activist Magazine, in the 1916. Yeah.
I suppose what I really like about that quote from him is the way that it sort of like stays with kind of the ambivalence of sports, right? That it's not always it's not this sort of pure morally good area. It can play out all these negative ways, like we just talked about it. As a piece of fascist propaganda in 1936, or for Argentina in 1978, or you might say for Italy in 1982, or there is a certain way in which hierarchical forms of power love to, I guess, as you might say in current terms, sport wash things, right? But what he's saying there is that dynamic of the sport washing or the negative effects doesn't mean you ignore it or get rid of it. You have to engage with it.
Yes, yeah. I mean, it's a great understanding of that quotation. I totally agree with you. I also when I watch, because I love sports, and I watch all the events when I can, and my heart was broken when I had to watch the World Cup 2018 in Russia, or like the sort of things which were very ambivalent for me, and it was after the annexation of Crimea. But this is also about the power. Sport is always about power. It's always, especially now. That's why the concept of the worker sport was kind of a little bit. I mean, it was also about the power, but in a different way, because it was kind of counter the hegemony of Olympic Games. Right now, we don't have anything what can beat World Cups by FIFA or Olympic Games. They are owned by kind of West, right? And sometimes there are like countries like Qatar or Russia, but they have money. But Olympic Games will never come to Poland or Czech Republic or Hungary. The same with the World Cup.
I will admit some enthusiasm for forms of a sporting association that are trying to organize otherwise. Here I'm thinking of things like CONIFA, which is the sort of football federation for stateless forms of football. So you have things like the Cascadio bioregion or Yorkshire. I totally love this notion, but it's super small and quite marginal, and they've had to postpone their World Cup for this year because they were going to do it in part of Iraq, part of Syria, Kurdistan. But it turns out that it's very difficult to do a World Cup in the middle of a war zone.
Yeah, I remember that like St. Pauli, we mentioned that club already, that they were organizing a sort of like sporting events for the society, like for the nations which do not exist, like which are not recognized international. Like for example, Gibraltar was there, or like at that time the Tibet, the Basque country, and so they were also organizing that kind of events. I remember, but I don't know if they are doing it now anymore.
Well, this is the part I have to admit that they have been doing an anti-racist cup every year, but they didn't do this one this year because they rented out the stadium to the England team. Oopsie.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, like also like St. Pauli right now, it's kind of they are losing a lot of fan clubs because of their, because they do not support Palestine, right? So it's like in Germany, it's like a very
Hmm.
huge topic, and this is why like also St. Pauli starts to be a little bit regarded from different perspectives than before
Hmm.
because they didn't issue the pro-Palestine statement. Yeah.
Well, I think we get to in discussions of St. Pauli then is how far can you push a certain kind of set of values or politics in sport until in the current existing, let's say, commercial sporting climate, those things start to come into sharp tension and contradiction with each other.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, and I also think that like St. Pauli is a good kind of example of how you look at the football club from the political perspective, not from the sport perspective. Because the fans, I don't think they are so much interested in sports, but they are interested in politics of St. Pauli, and I found that also kind of interesting. Uh,
hmm. But then it sort of gets back to the question of how you judge success of what you're trying to produce. Because if what you're trying to produce is a counterculture or a solidarity or a community, you can produce those things almost independent of the results, right?
Yeah, of course, yeah.
Um, I think we'll probably sort of nudge towards maybe ending soon, but maybe a good place to get to is if there could be another Red Sports International or sort of Workers Olympics, like what form do you think that might take today? And the reason I ask that is because for obvious reasons you wouldn't have, the central coordinating body of Soviet power. You'd probably be looking for a different kind of way of articulating that kind of culture, right?
Yeah, I mean it's a very good question. I mean, like the Red Sport International dissolved in 1937, right? I mean, later on there were still Spartakiads organized around the world, and also what is kind of interesting, I never had time to research it much more deeper, were the military Spartakiads organized by the communists, like for example in Cuba, in Havana, or like in so they were like kind of militants connected to the Spartakiads, especially in the 1960s, 70s, and 1980s. And then after the collapse of the Eastern Bloc, it also like this concept kind of dissolved. Right now, I don't know, like because actually Red Sports was also very much activists. Maybe not in Soviet Russia, where it was a propaganda tool, but definitely in Czechoslovakia and in Weimar Germany. And it was a sort of like activism against the establishment and also against fascism as well.
Mm.
Uh, I don't know what kind of red sports would be today. I mean, we are living in a very troubling times right now, like with also rise of a lot of right wing fascist groups around the world, and but I don't think that anything can be as much meaningful as it was red sport in the 1920s and 1930s. Right now, I think it's really very hard to compete the Olympic Games and the FIFA because they have just so much money and so much power that it's just not possible to kind of be to create something as a counter event, maybe in underground or for a few people.
The example I would think of, and because I didn't watch really sports or football when I was growing up until my son went football mad a few years ago. And as he was going football mad, I started to say, hey, well, you're interested in football, and I'm interested in like counterculture and anti-fascism. What would you get if you put those two things together? And then I stumbled across Clapton CFC in East London, who that year had just put out their kit based upon the flag of the Spanish Republic. So it was like, oh, here's this interesting thing where they're a community-run, fan-owned team, but they're also heavily embedded in anti-fascist networks in East London.
Yeah.
So yeah, so I think you can see sort of small things like that through various networks of sort of fan-owned teamed, but that it is admittedly quite marginal and nowhere near on the scale of yeah.
Yeah, I hope that there will be like a counter events one day, which will also kind of provoke the counterculture to be kind of more developing in that area. But we will see. I mean, like, I'm happy that there are some kind of clubs like St. Pauli still kind of operating, and there's also like in Poland one club which is called like anti-fascist club, but they are playing in the 7th league or 6th league, and they have like 50 fans, but they are also coming there to support more the politics than the sports, actually.
But in a certain way, the number of fans is not so important, because if there are people who are building a social world in a community around the club, that is a world for those people, regardless if the stadium is massive or not.
Totally agree. Yeah, that's the case.
So maybe one more thing as a way to sort of end up is what do you plan on working on next? Like, where do you go? What's your next project or current project or?
I'm working now on many projects. Kind of like my head explodes from the ideas, but right now I also work on more on art and like the artistic transfer or exchanges between Eastern Europe and the so-called Global South in the 1950s and 1960s. I work much more on the African and the Asian students who came to Poland to study at Fine Arts Academy. And this is kind of like a larger project I'm working on. But I would love to expand my research on sports and visual culture. And I will be having a fellowship in the US to work on the 1932 Los Angeles Olympics. So unfortunately, I will go a little bit away from the worker sport and work a little bit on the Olympic Games. But still, I would love to come back to worker sport and to make the second part of my book, because I finished with 1932, and I would like to do the second part from 1933 to 1940, which will be not focused on Central and Eastern Europe, but on the Western Europe, because it's the time when kind of Central and Eastern European worker sport, it's not kind of after the rise of Nazism in Austria and Germany, as well as a little bit in Czechoslovakia, the worker sport movement was much more active in the West. And of course in Russia, like not more in Central Europe. So I would love to work on that, and I hope I will find time, maybe in a couple of years, to write the second part.
Cool. Well, I look forward to reading that when that happens. But cool. Well, thank you very much for coming along.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was a huge pleasure to talk with you and about the subject.